delighted to be here with Kelly and have a discussion. It's really going to be, we call it kind of a fireside chat. We're going to have a discussion, talk about the trends, and then talk about how Cisco and Randstad are responding from a people perspective. So on the next slide, and I won't belabor what's on this slide because I think so many of us over the past several months have been reading a lot about the numbers and the impact of COVID on the economy and on organizations and on the workforce, and the numbers are staggering, right? 195 million job losses worldwide in Q2. U.S. as an example, 41.5 million people have applied for unemployment benefits, and weekly that number rises, often by the millions. I think we're all experiencing globally some pretty incredible and immediate responses by governments and stimulus plans and programs that are taking place to help with this phenomenal impact. I think the path to economic recovery remains highly uncertain. There's no question about that. There was a hope that the economic recovery would be a V, then there was hope it would be a U. Now there's speculation it may be kind of a continuous W as we deal with this COVID impact. So big numbers, wide impact, it's deep, it's probably going to be somewhat prolonged. And what do we do as organizations and as people leaders in response? So that's kind of going to be the theme of what we will talk about over the next hour. So just a bit of a tee up, and we can go to the next slide, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the research that our conversation is going to be based off of. Randstad Sourceright does an annual talent trends survey. So this survey was conducted earlier this year. Actually, it was conducted pre-COVID. We've taken some of the key trends and we've shaped some questions around them that are COVID related. So we want to talk about the trend and then talk about what impact it's having through the lens of COVID in each one of our respective organizations. So real quickly, the research involved 800 C-suite and human capital leaders, a global survey, so it covered 17 different countries, which are listed here on the right, across multiple industries. And so in addition to automotive and some manufacturing, we hit the financial services industry, consumer goods, life sciences, biotech, IT technology, et cetera. So pretty wide swath, senior leaders, global and multiple industries covered. On the next slide, we will cover high level the 6 trends that we pulled out of the survey data, and we'll drill into each one of these as we go forward. So the first one is building an agile organization with an agile workforce. I think, when I think of COVID response, and what organizations have been called to do and led to do and had to do, it's all about agility. How quickly can we make decisions and move forward without a lot of lead time? So agility we'll talk about in more detail. The second is data defines the labor market. How are we using data and insights across HR, across business, across labor trends and governmental data to help us make decisions as we deal with this COVID environment? So data drives and defines the labor market and responses for sure. The third is digital transformation reshapes workforce culture. We'll talk a lot about this, and Kelly's going to provide some really good insights as to what does it take and what has it taken to get people ready to respond to businesses and to clients through digitalization. The fourth is HR tech is critical to both business continuity and the talent experience. So as we're dealing with response, we're dealing with business continuity planning, and we're dealing with our employees and our clients and our candidates and whatever business we're in. How are we bringing that together through a technology platform? The fifth is hire for today and upskill for tomorrow. And through COVID, how are we looking at getting our people ready quickly to work in new ways? We're changing the ways we work. We're changing, in some instances, the work itself. how are we committing to and investing in upskilling to make that happen in the new post-COVID world? And then number 6 is managing your employer brand during a crisis. Really important. How we are all responding individually and collectively as organizations and as an industry and as a society really does speak a lot to brand. So we'll talk a bit about that. So that's a high level overview of the 6 trends that we'll be digging into. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about agility, right? Building an agile organization with an agile workforce. And some of the data that came out of the research was 31% of respondents said that their organization was completely prepared for a downturn in the economy. Really interesting when this was taken versus what we're all facing right now. So not a lot of organizations who responded to our survey were totally ready to respond to an economic downturn. There was some prediction that business and GDP would rise earlier this year. So this hit us all very quickly, and many were blindsided with respect to the impact and how deep it is hitting. There's a lot of uncertainty in the business. There's a lot of changing the ways in which we respond. So talk a little bit about agility, learning agility, response, speed. I'm going to turn it to Kelly and ask her to talk a little bit about some of the talent strategies that you've put in place, Kelly, since COVID hit, and how have you dealt with kind of speed and scaling as you've had to face working in different ways?
Yeah, it is such a topical question because I think all of us that work in talent have an understanding that a big piece of our role is being able to be agile to both internal dynamics and external market conditions. And I think that this year was an extreme test for all of us in that space. For Cisco, it was slightly less disruptive than many other workplaces as we had already developed a pretty strong infrastructure and culture of remote work. I, for example, have been working remotely off and on for the last 6 or 7 years. And so our use of the collaboration technology through our WebEx platform, it allows us to work securely from home. It was already pretty firmly established prior to the pandemic. Along with that, we have some pretty strong protocols on how to use the collaboration technologies in terms of when you email, when you instant message, how we all run video in our meeting, and having those things established kind of having to flip the switch and have an entirely remote workforce was pretty important. The other piece for us was really about leading teams remotely. I've noticed that one of the things that has come up a lot recently in companies is the desire to hire people who have opportunities to lead global teams in a complex dynamic environment. So we had a little bit of an advantage coming into this because most of our jobs could be done remote and most of us were used to working that way. So our focus pretty much went immediately to how do we care for our employees and our customers as well as our vendor partners. Most of our customers, I would say, were not prepared to onboard that high volume of remote users in that short period of time. So what we quickly pivoted to was how do we enable our existing customers to be able to, for example, it wasn't unusual for us to get a call saying we need 200,000 people online remotely in a secure environment within 2 weeks. And that's a pretty big lift. So we moved pretty quickly to how do we enable our existing customers? How do we care for those that we felt like were most vulnerable in the world with this pandemic? And how do we try to get our new customers online and working securely and productively pretty quickly? So that was really where we pivoted pretty much immediately, working not just towards the availability of the collaboration technologies for our employees, but also ensuring, the security piece, the dual authentication, the leadership best practices, and the collaboration tool guidance.
So Cisco was pretty fortunate. You had a lot in place already, unlike many organizations, right, Kelly? And you mentioned your clients for sure,
Yeah.
but yeah, you had a leg up, that's for sure. I think Randstad, a little bit of a mixed bag when COVID hit. The Randstad Sourceright organization, as part of Randstad, one of the global businesses, has a lot of remote workers. So we were well set up, very similar to Cisco. Other parts of our businesses, not so much. So we had to kind of in a very short period of time get 38,000 people across the globe working remotely. What was fortunate for us is we had done a couple of years of investment in the cloud, in technology, so we could, I'd say easily, quote unquote, easily make that transition. And again, we were set up, and some of us who are used to working remotely, I've been working remotely for many years, and others would provide training and tips and techniques for others who were just experiencing for the first time. So getting leaders ready to, how do you manage teams in a virtual environment, and providing training and kind of that upskilling that we'll talk more about as we go forward. But, getting the organization ready, and how does the technology that you've invested in and some of the protocols that you've established help to do that. So that is clearly a challenge that so many of our clients are dealing with and still continue to deal with. As you think about, Kelly, the kind of the types of talent, you think of the talent spectrum from permanent to contingent to the use of automation, did anything shift in that configuration for you, or is it shifting? Any differences there as you think about who you bring in to work at Cisco and decisions you've made around that spectrum of talent?
It's interesting because we've continued hiring throughout the pandemic, although it's definitely become more complex due to a few things, such as the supply chain issues for hardware, our need to very quickly develop a high-touch way to onboard people remotely that integrates them into our culture, and some of the other associated challenges. But what I would say is, with regard to our specific company makeup, we've always had a very blended workforce. So we have about 140,000 workers at Cisco, and at any given time, about half of those are vendors. And so the thing we focused on during the pandemic, and really, if you think about it, we're talking about the pandemic. There are kind of multiple pandemics happening right now. We have a health crisis, we have a financial crisis, we have a social justice crisis. All these things are kind of threaded through at the same time. So again, with us, it's a little bit about care for both our customers and our vendors. But in terms of what I see post-COVID, the biggest change I would say in our workforce demographic is, even though we are able to work remotely in almost all of the jobs that we have, we did still have some leaders in the ecosystem that wanted to have their employees sitting in the same space with them, wanted to be able to see and touch and know that they're there. And I will say that one thing that I have seen change, and I think this is probably answers your question for both vendors and full-time employees, is that there has been more of an open mind around getting the best talent versus getting the best talent in a zip code. Because I think leaders that haven't embraced as much the idea of remote work, even in our ecosystem, are starting to embrace it and realize that they can be as productive, if not more. And so it's unlocking for us on both the vendor and the full-time side, the ability to just make better hiring decisions. But I would say that contingent workforce is a key part of our talent strategy, and will probably continue to be post-COVID in a maybe more geographically flexible way.
That's a great point, really great point. I think people hopefully know that Randstad is in the business of helping organizations hire people, right? So it's affected, this COVID pandemic has affected our business in a couple of ways. Some people have stopped hiring, but Kelly, like Cisco and others, right, in the biotech arena, in the e-commerce arena, right, there are industries that are continuing to hire, some more receptive to the remote hiring experience than others. So, prove to me that my hiring managers don't have to meet face-to-face and interview those they are hiring, right? And so introducing some of those technologies like video interviewing and virtual onboarding experiences, and those types of things that some organizations really were not overly open or receptive to, kind of had to be. And they're delighted in many instances with the results. So I think we will be seeing more receptivity to looking at different models and different ways to recruit and to onboard, right? And where people are is not going to necessarily be important for many industries, and some it will, but in many industries, I think there's going to be that shift, and I think we will continue to see that. I think it's a really good point.
Yeah, without a doubt. I'm sure you've seen it with your clients. We've definitely seen it with ours, where we have some organizations we've worked with that have said, nope, we all have to be on site forever. And then, what I always tell people is it kind of takes 3 weeks, whether you're trying to embed a new habit around, exercising, becoming a vegetarian, deciding that you're going to work from home. It takes 3 weeks to feel comfortable. And we have many clients of ours now that are saying they're rethinking their entire real estate portfolio around, do we need to go back to live work with the risks associated with the return to office strategy? So I think you'll see a shift going forward around this that is going to be pretty permanent.
I agree. We're having those conversations internally at Randstad, and we're also having them with many of our clients. So, we tried to say the silver lining. Right? What are some of the positive things that have come out of this very hard time? And I think we're going to see some very different business models, some different commitments to remote working, and some kind of restriction on real estate. So I think
Hmm.
we're in for some change for sure. Let's go to the next trend and talk a little bit about data, defining the labor market. 81% of those surveyed said that talent analytics plays a critical role in sourcing, attracting, engaging, and retaining talent. And as I mentioned when I introduced the topic, I think using data and analytics has really gone to a next level as organizations are trying to figure out their current and their future response to either a downturn in their business or many of the other changes that COVID is having as an impact on how we all collectively do our business. Kelly, what kind of data insights are you using, and what has changed for Cisco as a result of COVID in terms of just using data and insights to drive decisions?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's interesting because I feel like using the data and business intelligence that you use to drive your talent strategy as well as your business strategy, it used to be this differentiator, people who had a good handle on their data, and now it's kind of a basic. You have to have a good talent and data strategy to be able to compete. And it's interesting because at Cisco, one of the fundamental parts of our business intelligence strategy specific to talent acquisition is based on the external workforce analytics and market insights and intelligence. So what we basically do is manage a strong partnership with our business leaders and our people and communities teams to make sure that we're continually identifying any skills gaps that may occur for us from a number of areas, which could be hiring demand in product growth areas or voluntary exits at Cisco or new technology spaces that we're going into. We also put a pretty strong focus externally on the talent market landscape. We try to understand the skill mapping, the market availability, the competitor demand intelligence, as well as the internal and external kind of talent pool skill analysis, so we can see where we're positioned well and where we need to make some adjustments to our strategy. But with regards to the data strategy, I think the reality is there's still a lot of uncertainty about the longer term impact with regards to skills from this pandemic. But what we're focused on now is identifying the future skills and capabilities that we're going to need enterprise-wide. And part of the way we are meeting the skills gap is by focusing on the data, not only externally, but internally in terms of understanding within our ecosystem what are the adjoining roles and skills that already exist in our workforce, because that's also a key source of talent for us.
So yeah, it's kind of looking out, looking in. What do we build
Hmm.
and develop, and what do we acquire, right? And so using data to help drive those decisions. As you look out, Kelly, into kind of the future of Cisco, how are you identifying the critical skills that you'll need as part of your workforce planning process?
We're doing that internally and externally just through the partnership that we drive with our business leaders and understanding where the business is going. We're an organization that has been on a long-term journey of transformation over the last several years. Some people associate Cisco largely with hardware, and we do still have a certain substantial size of our portfolio that is that, but we are increasingly more of a software company. And so when we start to think about the implications of that to our talent strategy and what those skill gaps are, we will use our partnerships with our business leaders and ops leaders, as well as our people and communities team. And people and communities at Cisco is essentially our HR team. It got renamed last year as a bit of an indication as to directionally where we were going and kind of who we wanted to be in the world with regards to communities, but people and communities is HR. So working with our high-level leaders and people and communities and our business leaders, we try to do an internal and an external scan on what we see as the increase in skills. We look at what are the skills that we are increasingly hiring for and looking for aligned to the new product areas. And then we try to understand internally, where do we have an opportunity to create readiness through any kind of training on the job or just reskilling of our employees, and then externally, where we would actually find those employees based on the external market analysis.
Right. So I think it's clear Cisco has and continues to use data, external and internal, and then you do your workforce planning around the combination of both of those. So really good examples. Thanks for those. On the next slide, we can go to the next trend around digital transformation, reshaping workforce culture. Kelly, you and I, we've talked over several of these about culture, and I think we could both talk for 2 hours about the concept of culture and how to reshape culture, right? So we have so many opportunities to do that as a result of COVID and as a result of some of the differences that you talked about that we'll look at into the future. So as you think about digital transformation, some people feel like it's moving too fast and they can't keep up with it, right? And how do we look at adoption across our workforces, and how do we continue to skill and upskill people around that digital fluency and that digital transformation that does help to drive the business in different ways? So for Cisco and for your clients, Kelly, how are you doing that? How are you adjusting some of that cultural aspect to processes, to the work itself, as you look internally and as you work with your clients? And talk a little bit about culture along the way.
Sure. So I'll probably start with our new mission statement, and Cisco Live is happening this week. And our new mission statement that we've kind of kicked off with is inclusive future for all. And if you think about the implications of having inclusive future for all as your mission statement, and how that connects to what we are trying to drive with connectivity and security and collaboration through the Cisco product line, it really does start to get to, as a culture, what we are aspiring to do. And when I think about what we did with our digital transformation and looking at change management around that through the pandemic, we really doubled down on communicating with our entire ecosystem, both our full-time employees, our contract employees. We immediately started a series of weekly check-ins. And so once a week for an hour and a half to 2 hours, Chuck gets onto a Cisco Live meeting with the entire Cisco ecosystem. And it's a panel that is also comprised of doctors, health coaches, mental health experts, to basically help answer questions and give some accurate scientific information to our employees about the pandemic, but also things around best practices about everything from grocery shopping to should I visit my elderly relatives. And so for us, the cultural aspect in response to this was to double down on just communicating often and inclusively. We also pretty much day one set up a very active pandemic planning site within Cisco that covers everything from the most recent health news to recommendations on how to use your time to give. We do 10 days a year of time to give where we pay our employees to volunteer. We were getting a lot of questions about not being able to do that because everyone was sheltering in place. So the pandemic planning site, reaches everything from the tactical stuff about health, but also to how to volunteer remotely and to help fight the virus. But the other thing we really did was I think we doubled down on calling on our leaders, our team leaders within Cisco, to lead with empathy and communication. We had a lot of employees that were, even though we could work remote very easily, and I mentioned that at the top of the call, I certainly don't want to make it sound like everyone had it easy because they know how to do it. We had a lot of employees that have really been struggling with the balance of working at home full time, some with personal situations where partners are home and children are home, and you're now a Cisco employee and a 5th grade math teacher at the same time, and that's very difficult. So in terms of how we address that as a culture, we've always had a bit of a flexible work from home culture, but with this, what we had to do was really take a bit of a step back in our expectations of how we thought employees were going to be able to show up, given kind of the mental, physical, and emotional impact of the pandemic that everybody was experiencing different. If you think about it, everyone's situation at home is different. Everyone has a different set of skills and support to be able to address what was happening. So we really tried to focus our culture on care for our employees, care for our, and when I say employees, I mean our entire ecosystem of Cisco, both our employees and our vendors, care for our customers. And we that's the way that we approached it. And it was interesting because we're very customer focused. We always have been, and we are now. Care for our customers is in the center of this. But what I did see was we made a really big pivot as soon as this hit to like, how do we make sure everyone's okay? And I think when you kind of tie that back to the idea of inclusive future for all, it becomes really important because your employees, they're the lifeblood. Those of us that work and are practitioners in the talent space, we know that we are only as good as our employees. And so care in that space is really critical. So for us, that became probably the heart of the cultural piece around this pandemic is just how do we ensure that our employees, customers, vendors are all cared for, and that we also are able to address the most vulnerable in the population.
That's just great examples of what Cisco has done in response. And you said something, Kelly, that triggered a thought for me. You're leading with empathy. And, I was talking earlier today with a group of leaders in our European market. And as I've reflected over the past several months, and it's been a long several months, there's no question about it, one of the things that makes me feel so good is when I look out at our leadership, I see them trying really hard to lead with empathy. And so there's this emergence, and you've done some reading on it, I'm sure I have as well, on empathetic leadership and how critically important that is during this time. And it's, calling people to it and helping them be that way, helping them structure questions to check in on people, helping them resources and sites that give them access to tools and materials on, how to ask the right questions and how to lead remotely, and, how to measure productivity in a way that is not, threatening because we are flexible and people are stretched so hard with childcare and teaching and all the things that you mentioned. So that's one takeaway that I've had as I talk about the silver lining of this. Empathetic leadership is clearly emerging as a skill that I'm proud to see, and I think we can continue to develop. Randstad has done some of the same things around putting safety and well-being at front and center to all of what we do. And we talk a lot about it, and we have brought in specialists as well to talk about how do you deal with anxiety? What are some tips that can help you deal with that work-life challenge that so many people are struggling with? So there's a lot there, and you get into the, yes, technology is great and data is great, but at the end of the day, how are leaders helping people survive and thrive in the instances where they can during this time? So, really good examples. Thank you for those, Kelly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's go to trend number 4. This one is, HR tech being critical to business continuity and the talent experience. So investing in, how do we assess candidates as we're hiring them, Kelly, across that talent spectrum, right? How are we making those decisions as to who we reach out to and how we build talent pools, and how are we thinking about the relationships and, the tech and the touch component? We talk a lot about that at Randstad, right? Tech and touch. Technology is the enabler, but the touch piece, and how do you, bring those two together? So if you could provide some insights on, how technology has enabled and how you kind of look at that tech and touch to drive your business.
Yeah, it's such a relevant question. And I would start by saying we did make a few small updates to our ATS. We use Avature at Cisco in support of being able to have better outreach to our candidates. But most of our response was actually human touch rather than technology, ironically enough, because we are a technology company. But given that we were kind of fully versed with the online collaboration tools, what we tried to do in that human touch side is provide the things that people were needing through that tool. So as an example, since the pandemic started, we've been using WebEx to do a multitude of things that we did not do prior to the pandemic. We have developed and enabled a high-touch remote onboarding program, which was something we had actually been needing to get at for a while. You know how you have that thing on your list that keeps moving over? That was the thing on the list that kept moving over and hadn't gotten done. And so in the spirit of never waste a good pandemic, we actually developed, rolled it out, and are going to continue utilizing it going forward, doing onboarding in cohorts of people through the WebEx technology. But we also used it in new ways to keep in touch with our teams and some of our recruits. And I personally attended and hosted multiple baby showers through WebEx, which is always really fascinating. We had virtual fikas with our teams to just, literally have a let's talk, let's have some coffee and give yourself some permission to eat a bear claw and let's see how you're doing and not talk about work. Happy hours, I think everybody's doing those. WebEx, I was being teased by a coworker about my number of WebEx meetings because I had a really high ranking. And I said, well, keep in mind, 4 hours of that is happy hour. But as we really, we moved from using the technology for just fast work collaboration to more of a lifeline to interact with each other. And we also used it, and this is another one that we changed during the pandemic, but I see some sustainable change for us going forward. Many live events were canceled, when the pandemic came forward. And there's one in particular that comes to mind. We attend the NSBE event every March for recruiting for our university programs, and they canceled the event. And so we pretty quickly pivoted that to let's do a series of our own smaller, more intimate NSBE live events using the WebEx platform. And we did that. We pivoted to doing it quickly. We actually had, I would almost say, better success in that environment than we do a large conference because we were able to connect more with the candidates. We also pretty quickly moved to do a 100% virtual intern program. And this is something that when I'm sure many of the people on the call had companies where it's hard to do an internship program remotely because part of the internship program is the experience you give them of being on campus and being in a campus environment. But we made the decision that we work 100% remotely and we would honor the commitments of the offers that we'd extended. So we're using WebEx now to basically facilitate our virtual intern program globally. So we've got about 1,500 students that their entire summer is a virtual intern program, which is quite interesting. And I think given where we are moving in the future, we'll probably serve them well. It's an unintended consequence. We would have preferred to have people on site. But I think that with remote work being what it is, the meeting protocols and the video protocols and all the things you learn when you work remote will actually end up being a pretty valuable thing for them going forward.
Really, really great examples. I think using technology kind of as we talked about the enabler and figuring out how to drive that connection, right? And I think we've experienced in an elevated way where we work remotely as Randstad Sourceright organization, but I've gotten feedback from a lot of people like I've never felt more connected to the organization, right? We have weekly all hands meetings. We do, virtual reading of stories to the children of our employees. I did the Velveteen Rabbit 3 or 4 weeks ago, and it's great. And not only is it gives parents a break and it's great for the kids, but it also helps us think differently and it humanizes us in different ways. So I think that's been another one of those silver things that have risen, right? We can connect. And in some ways, some of these virtual programs, some of the training we've done, we've retrofitted into a virtual environment and it's extended and there are more touch points and connection points. And so we're thinking like maybe this is the way we're going to do it going forward once travel is opened up. So it's just trying to make as many things as you can happen, right? And as many touch points to drive those connections using technology, but not only technology, right? It's the human piece around the technology that can really make that difference for sure.
That's absolutely right. And I remember the first week I had a lot of employees who their kids would come into the room during the call, and they would apologize and have this sense of like trying to push their kids out of the camera. And I was like, bring them in. Let's say hi, because this is where we all are right now. And it's okay to show up with authentically where we are. And if, your kid wants a snack and they're running in the room telling you that, that's okay. And I think back to the leading with empathy piece, there is nothing that helps us gain empathy of other people's situations than getting a bit of a line of sight into their home life and the challenges they're dealing with that oftentimes people aren't comfortable bringing into work. But now we see it because we have to.
It's exactly right. And the other thing that I'm thinking around this, Kelly, is companies opening up and sharing what they do well. And just an example of Randstad, very quickly, early on, as this pandemic was hitting, we decided as an organization that we were going to open up many of the technologies that we use. We partner with many, and we have an ownership in some emerging technology companies. And so we put a digital solution suite onto our website and offered it to our clients at no cost or very low cost, depending upon what the technology offering was, as a way to say, yeah, we're here to help you too, right? We use some of these effectively, and we want to share these with you. So we'll talk a little bit at the end of this about another alliance that Randstad has entered into with some competitors, actually, to try to help the industry with some return to work. So I think that's another thing that's come out of this. I see organizations being really open to sharing of their time. And you talked about the 10 hours and how can we do that remotely, a focus on that, just an opening up of sharing what we have and what we know in new and different ways as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, let's go to trend number 5, Kelly. We've talked a little bit about this, but hire for today and upskill for tomorrow. What are you doing? What are you committing to? What has changed around upskilling the organization? A lot of organizations say, yes, it's important, but either we're not doing it or we're not doing it to the degree that we can. So how are you future-proofing your workforce through this pandemic to making sure that people have the current and future skills needed?
Yeah. So at Cisco, we kind of go at this from both top down and bottoms up. So we have that dual approach as it relates to skilling. And so from an employee's perspective, we try to make sure that we're promoting a continual learning mindset. And we do that through an always-on digital platform that allows our employees to basically keep their skills up to date in a relatively low-cost manner. And that's kind of the bottoms up. I would like to learn this. I'm going to go and seek this that is more employee-driven. And from a business perspective, we try to prioritize those reskilling initiatives that are really enterprise in scope versus an individual organization scope. And the way that we do it is we focus on exposing employees to actual opportunities that provide a chance for them to gain experience and skills through the work. And then we layer in the learning experience to support the on-the-job experience. And this really came from, we conducted a pretty large-scale career study at Cisco where our data team interviewed, I think it was over 10,000 employees last year. And one of the trends that came out of that was, at Cisco, careers are not always linear, and that work growth is really the fuel for career growth. So when we asked our employees in the study, what does career growth look like for them? The focus groups most often talked about movement and new work rather than training. They explicitly called out how asking for new challenges and feeling what I would label as kind of a welcome discomfort is really what drives career growth for them. So in our survey, movement, again, surfaced as a top career need. And when we asked what was the biggest growth period of their career, or the people we interviewed most often said a new role and a new body of work. So yes, upskilling is critical for us. And we feel like creating opportunities through work is the best way to get there. Even if that work is a stretch assignment or a dynamic team assignment, we get a lot of our work done at Cisco through dynamic teams. So if I think about how I deliver my work in Joining Connect, it's a combination of a static team that reports to me, but then I have 3 other teams that sit in other parts of the organizations that partner with me to drive the overall strategy. And so that's another way I think people really get that experience.
Kelly, you talked about bottom up. So an individual, an employee decides they want a new experience or they want to upskill in a certain area. How do you get that mindset into the individual? We've had a lot of conversations around kind of career pathing and experience and, the ratios of experience to education to exposure and all of that. When you talk about bottom up and it's employee driven, what are your experiences with individuals taking that initiative and making that happen? Any data or
interesting
around that?
Yeah, this isn't data, so let me just preface this by saying this is a Kelly anecdotal answer. This is not a data answer, but I would say it tends to fall into that rule of like a third, and a third. And what I mean by that is I would say a third of employees are always looking for that thing to make them sharper. And we've all had those employees, many of us are those employees where we're always looking for that next challenge because we know that in the uncomfortable area of growth is where we really get development and acceleration with regards to our career. So there's kind of this third that you almost don't have to worry about because they're going to seek it. They're going to seek it through the digital learning platform. They're going to seek it through the stretch assignments, and they're going to continue to accelerate their careers. Then there's the second third that are pretty comfortable where they are, and they like the comfort. And they're not as maybe out on the edge seeking new growth and development. But one of the ways that we try to encourage it is we abolished the system of performance management several years ago, and now what we ask our leaders to do is a weekly check-in that basically gets at, are employees using our strengths? Are their strengths? Do they feel like they're contributing great value to the organization? We use engagement pulses through this tool as well. And so we use it as a bit of a pulse with our employees to check in on them and see where they are. And that oftentimes is a really great indicator of when somebody needs to sharpen the knife a bit. And what I mean by that is, we have people who might be checking in on TeamSpace and the question around, am I using my strengths every day? Am I contributing great value to the organization? Those two questions are the most indicative of engagement. And so what we're looking for is high engagement and learning. And so we drive a lot in this second third through leaders just being aware of what's happening with their employees. Employees who maybe have moved into something and are kind of comfortable and are not quite ready to move yet. And then that last third, I would say, are those that, are kind of in new jobs and they're absorbing, they're absorbing right now and they're in the learning curve right now. And they're not really talking or thinking about their next learning curve. But we drive a lot of it through just accountability of leaders with the weekly check-ins to know where their employees are, for those that aren't driving it on their own.
Right. Okay. That's great. We're doing much of the same at Randstad, Kelly. I think we, got away from the annual performance review process a couple of years ago, and we do what we call great conversations. So let's talk about the work, and let's talk about the future, and let's talk about your position in relation to both of those. And that has helped. That has helped really drive some different conversations and some different outcomes. There's always that balance, right, of leadership accountability, driving that from the top, and the motivation, interest, and seeking of the individual at that bottom up level. So it's typically a combination of the two.
Yep.
Are you doing anything different, Kelly, around measuring engagement of Cisco since COVID?
So we do quarterly engagement pulses, and so we've continued on with those. The only thing I would say is different is I mentioned earlier that we are doing a weekly check-in over Cisco TV, where once a week Chuck and our executive leadership team get together with all of the employees, and throughout the weekly check-in, we ask a series of polling questions just to see how employees are. We probably do maybe 4 over the course of 2 hours. So we try not to make it burdensome. We try to make it short enough that people will answer them and move on. That's been the only kind of new way that we've been pulsing our employees since the pandemic hit. We've been continuing on with kind of our monthly engagement pulse overall. And it's interesting, we have seen an impact in that. They're struggling. This question of like, am I contributing great value to the organization? That's been one of the ones that I personally have seen with teams decline a little bit, because I think people are just, what is happening right now is affecting executive functioning skills to a degree. And so I think you're seeing people that are not feeling as productive and are, in all honesty, probably not as productive as they were 6 months ago.
Right.
So we've introduced the polling questions through Cisco TV, but otherwise it's mostly been continuing on with the quarterly engagement pulses.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that we've done at Randstad, and it's temporary for sure, because we're mindful of fatigue, but we have instituted a weekly engagement check-in through our surveying tool, Pecan. And it's a limited number of questions, 4 or 5 questions. What's working? What could we be doing differently? What support do you need? It has some open-ended questions as well. And the comments have really helped to drive what we're doing week to week. We considered a month or so ago going from our all-hands meetings, which the CEO of our organization plus many of the leadership team panel, right? And we do some of what you talked about. We talk openly, we give information, and we, across the spectrum of business, of trends, of well-being and the like. We talked about maybe doing those every other week as things were stabilizing a bit. And the vast majority of comments, we love the all. We feel so connected. We look forward to them every week. We want to hear from you. We want you. So, of course, we kept them going. So we're using that data to drive some of the actions and the decisions that we're making. We'll migrate away from that over time, and we've just made the decision to go to biweekly, and we'll check that after the next month or two. But that's been a helpful vehicle for us as well.
That's great.
So let's go to our last trend, number 6, around employer brand, managing your employer brand for the near and the long term. 93% of those surveyed, of the 800 surveyed, view a positive talent experience as critical to attracting talent. So the reputation of companies, right, and the brand that they're exhibiting in the market, how they are, what they are, who they are, what they support, all of that is important as you're thinking about the attraction of talent. Anything, Kelly, that has shifted for you or that has stood out for you from a brand standpoint since COVID around Cisco and some of what you're doing and how it's impacting not only your employees, but those you're looking to recruit?
It's really interesting because the beauty of our talent brand strategy is the simplicity that instead of kind of having a talent brand that's out there pushing content, what we actually do is focus on amplifying the employee voices to attract talent. So we kind of have this overriding, if you see it, you could be it thought process around it. So we continue to use the voices and experiences of our employees to really demonstrate what life is like at Cisco. So during the pandemic, our brand strategy continued as it has been, but the stories have changed, and that the employee experience of our culture has shifted. So have the posts and our employee voice around it. And that is the very nature of employee-generated content. So our content went from desktop views of employees at home with the We Are Cisco to employees using ironing boards as temporary stand-up desks, just as an example. We featured blogs about employees whose children and pets were now their coworkers. We saw, as I mentioned earlier, all of our celebrations kind of moved to WebEx. So what we really try to do is listening and make sure that our employee social posts are aligned with the experience they're having. So we amplify the voice of the employee, and then we try to create awareness and connection around Cisco as a great place to work. And that's seen us through a lot of shifts, but perhaps nothing as big as this one. But I think that the only thing that I've seen that is changing is I think that the conversation that we're having, the weekly conversation around the pandemic, but also we've been having a conversation about social justice at Cisco for the last probably year off and on, and it's really accelerated with everything that's been happening in the U.S. Over the last several weeks. And what I've noticed is the tone and the voice of our employees around the pride to work has increased around that, because I think that for a large part, our employees want to be affiliated with an organization that has a focus on doing the right thing and ensuring an inclusive future for all. So I would say we didn't really change our strategy, but the tone changed because our employees' tone changed, and we have an employee-led brand strategy, if that makes sense.
It sure does. It sure does. And I think we're using our intranet site significantly as a way to have fun, as a way to have competitions, as a way to give employees a voice, right? What's working, what isn't, what are they doing that others may learn from. So giving employees that voice clearly helps with connection, engagement, and ultimately with brand. So some similar experiences to the good examples that you talked about. So those are the highlights of the trends, everyone. We're going to shift a bit to talk about safe return to the work site. Not return to work where we've all been working, but return to the work site. So just a quick, I mentioned, collaboration and organizations working together. I just want to mention something that Randstad is doing. Randstad, with two of our competitors in the staffing industry, have formed an industry alliance to help prepare for the new normal and getting people back to work. And white papers have been authored, and this guide that you see a picture of here on the screen, a practical guide to putting a plan together. Some organizations are down the road, but this is a resource. If you're still looking at how to create or how to tweak, this might be a resource that will be helpful for you. It has a lot of different health and safety measures, and it's structured in a framework that it evaluates level of risk and level of economic impact across multiple measures. And it goes through some examples of a couple of industries as well. So here's a resource for you. It was put together in conjunction with Randstad, two of our competitors, and McKinsey as one of our partners. And, it's 67 pages. I don't want that to scare you off, but I think it's content rich. And it can even be a check against some of what you have already established to see if there are some new ideas or to validate what you've already put together. So check that resource out if it's of interest and it might be of help. So we want to close with getting some insight, Kelly, from you on the next slide as to what measures and protocols is Cisco putting in place to help your teams return. You're a virtual organization, you do a lot of remote work, but you do have some office locations. So what are you doing at Cisco?
Yes, we do still have our office locations around the globe. And given the volume of countries that we're in, our approach is, as you could imagine, somewhat country specific in terms of we are following a bit what's happening in terms of new cases and safety in the countries where our offices are, kind of as the starting place of when we start to have what we're calling return to office conversation, because to your call out, if everybody's been working, it's a return to office plan. And this has been a pretty intense body of work from our Ops and Workplace Resources organization with IT and safety and security and our health connection on-site facilities. And it's a combination of things. We're putting into place all of the recommendations around distancing in the workplace, around temperature before you go in the building, around creating a different type of communal space in terms of access to food and drink and other things that you might normally have that are going to have multiple touches. So it's a fairly thorough, I haven't counted the pages up to know if it's 64, but my guess is it's probably pretty close in terms of all of the things that we are recommending employees do. But the first thing I want to emphasize is we're actually not flipping a switch on return to office, nor are we making it mandatory for anyone to go back. We are setting up a system that says for those areas where we have organizations that need to be or want to be live in an office, we're going to prioritize that first. So if we have networking services where we have people who need to be live in a building, we're going to prioritize that first in terms of return to work. We're going to do it in a way that is staggered so that we have a lot of thoughtfulness around distancing and shared spaces. So it's fairly comprehensive, following all of the guidelines, and I would say maybe going a little bit past that in terms of just ensuring the health and safety of our employees and our vendors.
Yeah, great points, and I think the voluntary component is something that Randstad is adopting as well. I heard somebody say around this, it's not flipping a switch, it's a dial, and there may be some dialing back depending upon how infection rates hit, right, by country, by region, by so it is definitely not flipping a switch. There's a gradual, selective, safe approach. Good comments there. So we've left a couple of minutes, not many. If any questions have come in or if anybody has any questions, we would be happy to answer them.
Absolutely. Thanks both of you for the stimulating discussion. So We do have a couple questions that have come in, so we'll try and get to those. And apologies in advance to anybody who's asked a question we don't get to it, but we will be the folks at Randstad Sourceright will get the full transcript of all your questions and can follow up as needed. So Kimberly has a Kristen has a question about wanting to know more details about the virtual intern program.
Sure. So we run is that mine, I'm assuming? Or
yes.
I'm assuming that's me. Okay. Yeah, so we hire about 1,500 interns a year at Cisco around the globe at different times, because different countries run their intern and co-op programs at different times. And so what we basically did was, when all of this started happening and there was a lot of uncertainty around, is it going to be a month? Is it going to be 2 years? We just decided we're going to go ahead and just make the decision that we're doing it virtually. And in best case scenario, if things started to open up, we would be ready for that. But we would be ready for the worst case scenario, which is no one is going into an office. So basically what we did was, we had about 1,500 people with offers that were getting ready to start. We typically fill the demand for our intern program at the beginning of the year. So by January, February, kind of March at the latest, we know who is coming into those roles. That timeline is actually the US. They usually start around May or June. So what we basically did was, we took our intern experience team, which is part of our university team, and they designed a program for the interns where they would be connected with their managers. And one of the first things we did was ask, are you comfortable doing this virtual? Because that's the other piece of it. There could have been people who had personal situations or space situations where they weren't able to do it. So we started with, are you comfortable doing it this way? And when the answer was yes, we essentially made sure that they were connected with the manager that they were going to work for, that the manager got training on how to manage a remote intern, that we developed all of the social things that were able to happen remotely that we normally do live.
That's great. That's a great summary, I think, and I hope that was helpful, Kirsten. Okay, looks like we're at the end of our time here today, so I'll just go ahead and wrap up. Thanks, everybody, of course, for the stimulating discussion, and those trends really, I think, are probably reflecting a lot of what everybody else is seeing in the marketplace right now. So good to hear both of your thoughts on all of that, and a reminder that just to say thank you to Randstad Sourceright, that thank you for making all of this possible today and making great content available to us. I also want to remind everybody that you're probably thinking about where do I get my HRCI credits, my SHRM credits, my HCI continuing education credits. I have good news for you. This webcast has been approved for all of those things, and the credits for attending this webcast will soon show up in your My HCI dashboard profile. So just give us about 24 hours, and we will get all of that information up in there. And the way you find it after the fact is go to your My HCI dashboard up in the top right-hand corner of your screen, click on Learning, then click on Download Transcript, and you'll get everything that you're looking for. Then another thing to take note of is don't forget to check out everything else we got going on hci.org. Lots of free content, as well as information about our certification programs and our events. We're putting on some exciting virtual events this summer, so I hope you check those out. And I'd also like to thank you, the webcast viewer, just for spending an hour with us. We know you got a busy day, and probably kids, pets, and everything else coming at you. So thank you for spending some time with us, and we will see you next time.